All right, that segues very nicely into what I'm going to talk about, and I apologize for the lack of voice. I'll try to project as much as possible. What I'm going to do is talk about two sort of early studies of mine that really try to get inside the black box about what kind of context teachers are going to be more effective in and more likely to stay in. So this is all motivated by what I think is often called the egg crate model of teachers. I like to call it the Lego block model of teachers, maybe because I grew up in the 80s. And I think if you look at the basic model, the first sort of implication is that teachers are basically interchangeable units. A teacher who's going to be equally effective in one school relative to another. And another implication is that the context within which teachers operate is essentially irrelevant. So what I'm going to do is talk about two papers that I have written that are going to speak to this issue. So I'll just say on the outset that, in my opinion, it's often the case that I think the value-added literature has been very, very influential in informing policy. It also gets a lot of attention. So a lot of what I'm going to be doing is using the value-added framework, warts and all, to sort of shed some light on these issues in a way, so sort of using the value-added model to sort of shed light on the broader importance of context. So the first paper is really just going to ask the question, does teacher effectiveness vary across schools? And sort of similar to what John already said, I'm going to talk about teacher effectiveness in terms of teachers who improve test scores. I have other work that sort of mentions that this is not, certainly not an overall holistic measure of what teachers do, but it's a measure nonetheless. And then the second one is going to ask the question whether effectiveness, and I'm going to define effectiveness as being the ability to raise student achievement as measured by test scores, is that something that can be learned from colleagues? And I think whether teacher effectiveness is going to vary across contexts is actually really, really important for policy. One implication, and when I talk about whether it varies across context, what I'm really referring to is the match. So when you have teacher A at school 1 performing better at school 1 versus school 2, that's actually potentially really important because it means that first, when we talk about teachers as being high quality versus low quality, we're talking about them as though that's an immutable trait, when it's not. The second implication is that it means that the way in which we distribute teachers across schools can be leveraged potentially to maximize student achievement. If certain teachers are systematically more effective at certain schools or with certain kinds of students, and that's something that we know, we could use that information potentially to maximize the match quality between the school and the teacher. And I think the extent to which teachers acquire skills or learn how to teach more effectively from their colleagues also has profound implications for equity issues. When you look at the distribution of teachers across schools, there's certain schools that have very high shares of teachers that are first-year teachers that may not be as effective as you'd like. Other schools have many, many veteran teachers. And if early career teachers learn how to teach by being around other high quality teachers, you're going to potentially be depriving them of that resource by having this large differences in distributions over time. So the first paper is basically looking at the importance of match quality. And the way that economists tend to think about this, and I am an economist, is that generally workers tend to prefer to be in work environments in which they're more productive, and that's how we sort of think about this. And if this is true, workers are going to tend to leave or teachers are going to tend to leave schools at which they're less well matched towards schools at which they're better matched. So one pattern I look for in the data is to see when a teacher changes schools, do we see that she ends up being relatively more effective in her new environment relative to what she was doing before. And that's basically what these figures show here on the left. Year 0 is a year before a teacher moves, and all the positive values are the years after she moves. And what this basically shows you is that when teachers move, they tend to systematically perform better after they move than they did before. This is true both in reading and also in math. So, and this is also true even after accounting for the characteristics of the schools to which they move from and also the ones that they move to. So this thing appears to be quite important. When I measure this thing, I find the importance of match is actually on the order of about half the size of the teacher effects. So if we think teacher effects are large, this is about half the magnitude can be attributed to the match. Another point that I make in this paper is that this match actually has implications for teacher mobility. So if you are able to maximize the match between a teacher and the school, then the teachers are going to be, first of all, they're more effective in those schooling environments, but also they're more likely to stay in those working environments. So what I basically found is that teachers at good schools, schools being those things that affect all teachers in the school equally, are less likely to switch schools. You stay at schools because they're good, and that sort of makes sense. Another thing I find is that teachers who are better teachers, and that would be teachers who are good across all schooling environments, are less likely to exit the profession, which is good, but they are very likely to switch schools because they have good options. But the third finding is that teachers who are very well matched to their specific school are very unlikely to leave, and they're very likely to stay where they are. So this is sort of a black box in the sense that I haven't specified exactly what I mean by match, but those things that make teachers more productive in a particular school tend to also be associated with those teachers staying in those schools. So I think from a policy perspective, we want to know what those matches are and how we can better foster those matches. And I think that's an area for further research, using the sort of data that we've already seen from like John and Matt, in terms of measures of school climates and how that might relate to teacher characteristics is exactly the kind of research I think we're going to need to delve deeper into this box. The second paper I talk about is basically trying to ask the question, do teachers learn how to improve effectiveness over time from their colleagues? So all I do in this paper, just to be very simple, is I'm going to basically look at the same teacher who's in the school over time when the identities of her colleagues change. So I have a small schematic over there where I have basically a school, and I have the fourth grade teachers and the fifth grade teachers. In fourth grade, I have teacher A, B, and C in the year 2000, and in the year 2001, I have A, B, and D. So what's happened is teacher C has been replaced with teacher D. In that same school in the fifth grade, they have teachers X, Y, and Z in both years. The basic idea is that if teacher D is much better than teacher C, and the incumbent teachers are learning from their colleagues, we might observe that teachers A and B basically experience some relative improvement in their effectiveness compared to teachers in fifth grade who did not see a change in their colleagues. And that's basically the research design. So when I look at the data, what I basically find is that, just to summarize what these numbers mean, if you look at a teacher, the effect of having an own teacher, this is the effect on students of having an own teacher at, say, the median of the value-added distribution versus at the 85th percentile. This is associated with improving test scores of about 12% of a standard deviation, so it's a pretty big effect. But it's also true that increasing the average quality of her colleagues by that same amount is improving test scores by about 40% of that. So that's basically telling you that improving the own teacher is important, but if you can improve the characteristics of our colleagues, that's also quite important and about 40% of the effect size. So it does matter quite a lot. We see a very similar effect for math and reading. The effects for reading are somewhat more muted. So one question is, why are teachers performing better when they're surrounded by colleagues who are more effective? And learning from their colleagues is the sort of the mechanism I think that's at play. So the first thing that I observe is that I see much larger effects among teachers who are early career teachers, who tend to be learning those skills over time. As we just saw, teachers are always learning, but their learning is much more rapid in those early years, and those are exactly the same years when teachers are most effective. We also see larger effects for teachers who have stronger labor force attachment. Those are teachers who are career teachers as opposed to those who might just be coming in. So teachers who are career teachers and are willing to make an investment in their careers are also most affected by the characteristics of their colleagues as measured by their value added. And the other thing is that learning is a cumulative process. So one of the interesting findings in this paper is that the value added of the teacher's colleagues in the past is actually a better predictor of how a teacher performs today than the value added of her colleagues today. So it basically implies that who a teacher was exposed to in the past has a lot of import for how effective she's going to be today. And in fact, if you look at the data, when you measure teacher value added, I find that about a quarter of the effectiveness of a teacher can be explained by the quality of the characteristics of her colleagues over the past 4 years. So a lot of what we see a teacher do in the classroom is a direct relationship with the quality of the colleagues to which she's exposed. Yeah, so those are basically the overall findings. And I think, So the overall implications, I think, of the work are that context is going to matter quite a bit. I think a lot more work needs to be done and should be done on measuring context and identifying the contexts that are going to foster effective teachers and also foster the environments in which teachers are going to be happy. The research that I'm finding here basically documents that, fortunately, those environments tend to be one and the same. Teachers who are happy tend to be more effective, and that's what I'm finding in this case as well. And also, sort of using the fact that teachers can learn from their colleagues in policy is going to be tremendously important. For one, we can design mentoring programs like the ones that John just mentioned to take advantage of high-quality colleagues when they are in those schools. It also means that we might want to think about how to structure professional development more generally to have not sort of team teaching, but team planning, these sorts of things. I think it also has implications for models of teacher reward. If we're going to reward teachers by having a incentive-based system that pits teacher A and teacher B against each other when they're in the same schooling environment, that may be bad because it might actually be deleterious to the sort of collaborative nature of things, and that might actually undermine this sort of positive spills you might see across teachers. So I think it has important implications for us to think about schools as learning environments rather than essentially Lego blocks that are basically places to stick one teacher versus another.
Thanks.